Thank you all, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you tonight to talk about what is for me and what has been for me for the last 25 or 30 years, a bit of a passion, and that is to discuss the differences that exist between cultures and to find ways to make bridges across those differences. Everybody here knows about the cultural differences that exist from your own experiences between the French and the US Americans. And when John came to me and said, talk about these differences, I said, how can I speak about these differences to a group that's already experienced them in your own lives? But perhaps what I can do is put a little bit of a formal understanding to what you have experienced yourselves. We've been managing some very classic issues, and I want to talk about what some of those classic issues are, because I think perhaps you're all familiar with them in your own experiences. Je pense donc je suis. Who said that? Descartes, oui. A mathematician and a philosopher. And that's an important coincidence. Yeah? Because what was Descartes talking about when he said, Je pense donc je suis? When he was there laying the foundations for what became the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, a tradition that both US Americans and French share. Yeah? Okay, je pense donc je suis. What is the Cartesian way of thinking?
Inverted pyramid.
An inverted pyramid. Explain what you mean by that, please.
Because we think, Americans think, we take a small little thing and we expand out our ideas and all our options, and we're taught, especially at law school, find all your options, whereas the French, and it's wonderful, take a lot of information and they distill it.
Exactly, okay. So one of the differences, one of the classic differences that we talk about is this issue of what Americans perceive as the requirement on the French side of getting all of the information. It's looking at the entire encyclopedia before we can take a baby step. And the American perception, and the American perception of the French, therefore, being in a constant state of analysis paralysis, right? And we were speaking with both the Americans and the French about this issue, and we said, why does this difference exist? And it goes back to Descartes. It goes back to the need for conceptualization, the need for understanding and eliminating all possibilities until we are left with the only remaining conclusion we can possibly have, which is then irrefutable if we've looked at all of the details. When we cross La Manche, we're now in Britain, and it's different. It's Anglo-Saxon. It's not what we refer to as deductive thinking or Cartesian thinking, but in Anglo-Saxon thinking, it's about inductive thinking. It's about coming to the conclusion quickly and then finding a way to implement it. There's the emphasis on getting it done and results orientation without necessarily a deductive logical path to it. But in the continental tradition, we have to first find a deductive logical path before we can come to the conclusion. There was a joke in The Economist magazine many years ago of two French managers speaking with each other. And The Economist magazine, an Anglo-Saxon publication, right? And two French managers speaking with each other. And one manager turns to the other and says, well, it'll work in practice, but it will never work in theory. Now, I saw this emphasis on the need for an intellectual process, a deductive conceptualization before taking action. I saw this happen to me in my own experience when I visited my friends Cynthia and Armando, who had a lovely chateau, a moulin, actually, in the south of France. It was a small town near Cannes. And I visited Cynthia one day, and I was expecting to have a lovely meal with her and her family. And I got to the door of the moulin, and I knocked on the door, and I said, Cynthia, we're here. And she said, I'm so glad to see you, but I have some disappointing news. This was a 15th century moulin that she and Armando had purchased. And you can imagine the work that's necessary to get a 15th century moulin up to modern standards, right? Some of you may have had your own experiences with something like that, yeah? And she said, I'm sorry, but the plumbing is not working. So we're going to maybe have to go to a restaurant. I said, well, Cynthia, that would be a disappointment, but I'm here just to see you, and however we have to do this, if we can't have the meal in the Moulin, we can have the meal in the restaurant. She said, nope, but I called the contractor, and he's coming over. He promised he would be coming over to fix the plumbing. So let's wait. A few minutes later, the knock on the door, the contractor arrives. Cynthia explains to him, she says the plumbing isn't working, and his response, c'est impossible. So Cynthia explains, no, it's not working. The water's not coming out. He says, c'est impossible. And he walks into the room and he unrolls a blueprint on the table. And he's now demonstrating to us why the plumbing works. And I'm thinking now, as the culturalist looking at this, I'm saying, this is a beautiful illustration of precisely the issue that American managers and French managers have with each other. So Cynthia says, I understand that the blueprint says the plumbing should work, but in fact it's not working, come with me. And she takes him to the plumbing under the sink, and she shows him it's not working. And he goes, this is a problem. What does he do? This is the moment where we see the difference between the French mind and the American mind. Instead of going under the sink, he goes back to the blueprint to look for the error in the plan, in the process, in the thinking. And he, after looking at the blueprint and going under, the moral of the story is that we did get the plumbing working that night. But I'm thinking, if this did not occur in France, but in fact if it occurred in the US, in Paris as opposed to Peoria, the plumber would have gotten under the sink immediately and to hell with the blueprint or a plan. I think about just some of the discoveries that have been made, right? I mean, without the deductive logic, Marie Curie would never have been able to deduce the existence of the X-ray, right? Pascal would never have been able to deduce the fact that we have laws governing human relationships and build them into a structure known as sociology. But without the Anglo-Saxon inductive way of thinking, Alexander Fleming would have left that piece of bread on the windowsill. And when he came the next morning and discovered the development of mold on it, he wouldn't have asked the question, what do we do with this? Because there would have been no logical blueprint that led up to it. And so there's a value to both ways of thinking.
And I'm just wondering, this may be off the topic and you may want to talk about it later, but my experience in France, and I usually go every year and I have a lot of friends there, is that making money is somehow not particularly not respected, or not, if you've made a lot of money, you don't want to talk about it, or there's something dirty about it. Is that what you perceive?
I think if you're looking at an orientation toward money, you know, you have the American orientation to money, where it plays a very big part. And then you have a more continental orientation and a French orientation, where life is bigger than just work, or the American work is life. And now, I remember one time I was walking down the street in Bratislava, certainly not France, right? But as I'm walking down the street in Bratislava, my Slovak friend of mine leans over to me and he says, stop smiling. He said, you smile too much. He said, in this country, if people walk down the street smiling, they're considered simple. I was thinking about this. And I was thinking about it in terms of the peaches and the coconuts. You see, US Americans are peaches. That is, it's easy to get started with the US American. You ask a few questions, and they tell you everything, right? Where they work, what they do, how many kids they have. And it's like biting into a peach. It's soft, it's tasty, it's inviting. But as you eat through the peach, you get to the hard center nut. And then suddenly the American seems to cut it all off. It goes so far and no further. Now, the opposite is continental Europe, and as we move from west to east, it gets more coconutty. So by the time you move into Germany and then into Central and Eastern Europe, you really hit the coconuts, as I did in Bratislava. So this is where it's hard to break that outer shell. And in fact, why be inviting strangers that you don't even know and telling them everything right at the beginning? Here, before we say anything to anyone, we have to be sure that we can trust them. We have to be sure that we are going to have a long-term relationship. And once we crack that shell, inside it's soft and warm and sweet. And that relationship lasts a long, long time. What happens when coconuts and peaches come together without an understanding of this process is that the peaches, of course, immediately make judgment about the coconuts. The peaches say, oh, these people, they don't smile. They're not friendly. They're not welcoming. They're not inviting. They don't care about me. They're rude. And what happens, of course, the coconuts make judgments about the peaches. Oh, they're deceptive. You can't trust them. Just when you think you're being invited to become a good friend, they kind of close the door and disappear. They're really not sincere. Which I alluded to before takes us to this moment in time right now, where we have our President Trump in the US, and we have the forces of similar populism in France, Le Pen, Marine, as well as in the UK, Brexit, and in much of Western Europe. Okay. Where is the cultural piece to all of this? And how are we feeling about this moment? I mean, some of us are feeling, I suppose, a bit of desperation. Some of us are feeling lost in it. Some of us are feeling perhaps that there's something good that may come out of it all. No one has a crystal ball. But what I can do is I can look to history. And I can look to the legacy of both cultures. Both countries, strongest allies, the first allies. I can look at the legacy of the Enlightenment, which France gave to the world, and which the United States then worked on and developed even further. I can look at the interesting legacy that exists in the US, which is a combination of the best of French culture and the best of Anglo-Saxon culture put together. Also, perhaps some of the negatives as well. But the essence of France is not, I believe, Marine Le Pen. It is the Enlightenment. And it is all that has happened before. And I think the best of the US is not this moment of Trump. I think the best of the US is what we came from, what we created, and what hopefully we can create going further. It's difficult in a significant historical moment to see the big picture. If we look at a culture like China, one could say, for example, that China's going through massive change. But we know that if we look at the long view of history, China is actually behaving as China always has for 5,000 years. And whether it's significantly changing fundamentally, or are the changes that we're seeing in China superficial versions of a more basic behavior that we can identify as Chinese? I believe it's the latter and not the former, because all of my work indicates that. And I think we can take the same lesson and apply it to France and to the US. But I believe that we've been through similar tests. And if the institutions are strong enough on both sides of the Atlantic, and I believe that they are because the legacy and the traditions that created them is stronger than the moment and stronger than the man or the woman. We don't know. I may be proven wrong. But if history is any guide, and if the way that cultures work is any guide elsewhere, I believe we'll come through this moment and return to the legacies that we've given each other. So, thank you all very much. Well, shall we make a final toast to the Enlightenment, to the institutions, and not to the man? Oh.